good morning, good afternoon, and good night, depending in which time zone you are at the moment. My name is Djeffal. I'm professor for law, science, and technology here at Technical University Munich. Here, I mean here, of course, we are in the shared virtual space. It's my great pleasure and privilege to moderate this high-level panel on governing AI, the role of policy and regulation. And before I give a very short introduction, let me introduce the panel to you. With us today are Maria Axente, who is responsible AI and AI for Good lead at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Maria advises partners across industry, academia, governments, and more on how to harness the power of AI in an ethical and responsible manner. And she played a crucial part in the development and setup of PwC's UK AI Center of Excellence. Manuela Mackert, a C-level executive, has also played a big role, but with another company, the Deutsche Telekom, where she assembled more of 20 years top management experience. But she's responsible for its privacy and Deutsche Telekom's privacy and security assessment process, and has been a thought leader in digital ethics and initiator of the DT group-wide AI initiative. She co-authored also the guidelines and many other influential standards and also the development of the digital ethics radar. I'm also very glad to welcome Stefan Verhust, who's co-founder and chief research and development officer of the governance laboratory, which you might know as the GovLab of New York University, an action research center focused on improving governance using advances in science and technology, including data and collective intelligence. Yeah, not only artificial intelligence, but collective intelligence. Warm welcome, Stefan. And last but certainly not least, Roberto Andrade, global public policy and tech ethicist, expert, legal scholar, and researcher. Norberto works at the intersection of AI, ethics, and public policy at Facebook, but he's also he is also professor at IEAI Law School in Madrid and affiliate scholar at Stanford Law School, the Center for Internet and Society. And it's really great to have such a learned and experienced panel which knows theory and practice, because I think we are in a way in the middle of policies coming into practice and really coming to life. And you can see this especially from regulation. Yeah? We have, I think, 173 ethical frameworks already, as counted by the influential NGO Algorithm Watch. And OECD counted 700 policy instruments of 60 countries concerning AI, all focused on AI. So this work is already in place, but now it's about policy implementation. And here we are really in the middle of regulatory efforts all around the world. So at the end of November, you might have witnessed that UNESCO published its recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which were signed by 193 states. This is not a binding legal instrument, but it's very influential because it shows an international consensus on many questions. Such a consensus can also be viewed with another international organization, the Council of Europe, who draws up a regulatory framework, is in the process of drawing up a regulatory framework for AI. The European Union has not only published its proposal for an AI Act, but also several reactions from EU institutions, and the whole discussion is really pumping at the moment, while other countries like Brazil or China have also come forth with proposals. For example, the Chinese Cyberspace Administration has this draft on algorithmic recommendation management, whereas Brazil has a very principled principled proposal that Congress passed a few weeks ago. And there is not only on the country level, but of course also on other levels. So federal states, but also cities have tackled several AI issues. Maybe most known is the work of several US cities on facial recognition. So you see that we are really at a crucial moment where the discussion is pumping, and I would like to discuss with the panelists and you. So this is really my my offer to you. Whenever you have a question, please be active and reach out. We always have a significant proportion of the time reserved for those for your questions, and the whole session will be structured in 4 questions, which I'll try to share in the chat right now, so you can you know where we are at a certain point in time. And the first question to kick us off is, what do you regulate when you regulate AI? And you could take a narrow approach on this question and think, well, what is AI and what do we regulate? As you know, the European Union is really fighting about that at the moment. But you can also take wider notions and say, well, what is the purpose of this regulation? Or what aspect of AI? Is it the use? Is it the development? Is it the data management? What are the aspects we are looking at? So this might be a good point to bring you in, Manuela, because you spent a lot of time thinking about standards and ethics frameworks. And it would be great to have a first input to this question from you.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian, and for joining. And I would like to share a slide with you all together, because I guess that is the best opportunity to see the complexity. Hopefully it will work. Yes. So maybe the pink ones are the main structure terms that you will see in my introduction I would like to cover. So AI transforms values, trust, and power. So Christian mentioned it just, world leaders are facing a new great power competition. The ability to use new technologies, unlock new economic potential, manipulate social media, threaten national security interests. So you see, the world leaders are competing for data and technology on one hand side, and on the other side for power and control. So governments are striving to build appropriate digital infrastructure, collect and control digital data, as just mentioned from Christian, on which kind of level they are now interacting. And so AI is about to become the central processing engine for all data. And you see, and Christian mentions just with his long list, the governments, the world leaders, all of them, they are formulating and implementing AI policies. But as well, you see, there is a shift in the societal perspective with regard to the ethical as expected things with regard to ethical capitalism, and on the other hand side, how to behave correctly from the state and the authorities. So the growing public criticism of technologies is now that the collect data from for commercial purposes is given, public surveillance and security. And so in Europe, there is the EU maxim, the level playing field for all who want to do business with data in Europe must apply. I know maybe we have an unlevel modus with regard to China, maybe in the mentioned guidelines from China, which is just focusing the private sector, but the AI regulation striking a balance between safety and innovation. And they have to cover minimum 3 players or dimension. On one hand side, the use of AI by governmental entities, and as well, secondly, by private individuals and by companies. And so the question is how to anchor a minimum standards to comply with value principles. And it's about practicability. Now, I guess it is not a practicability modus, what is now written down. There is a lot of things, and I hope the company association to develop a bit of better progress in this with different kind of statements, and the enforcement, because we see with the GDPR, there is such a complexity that the national authorities and institutions are not able to work together. So with a lot of things we have to have in focus, it's about practicability and enforcement. And so this complexity, as shown in the slide, there's a various set of measures and competencies of responsibility required. And so the first thing, that was my experience with my initiative in Deutsche Telekom world, it started 2017, is that we need desperately a definition and a delineation of the technology, AI, by respective use cases to make it more tangible, because this is crucial. But the legislator should refrain from defining AI. So the emergence of the new risk landscape, and this was my portfolio as well, being responsible for compliance and to protect legal interest and specific company interest, there is a problem with AI from my perspective, that the systems are used in extremely different areas of application. And even from a compliance perspective, and when we try to design the trend radar and the AI technology impact assessment to find out which kind of application evolve its own dangerousness and changes in perspectives. So what my resolution was in the end, it is desperately needed a transparent and integrative overall risk mitigation concept. So it is a consistent overall risk system to categorize the risk, if it is material risk or non-material risk, to see the measurement and to establish a comparability. Otherwise, nobody wants to believe in it. And so again, the necessity of use cases is a must. We understood from my experiences the criticality, the possibility to uncover blind spots, to develop and to derive scenarios, which then led to the standardization. And that is a very important thing, standardization of risk fields. And we started with the point direct human contact, particular sensitive data, and for sure, sensitive field of application like image, voice, and face recognition. And it helps us a lot to find out what is important. And this brought us to the thought that ethics by design should and must be a mandatory factor from the beginning of the development process and implemented in existing procedures and processes, because it must breathe the whole system. And that's brought us another thing, which important is for regulatory things as well. It's design by value, it's data quality. And so I learned it, and it is about the standardization roadmap in Germany. And Maria will know, because we have been the first early adopter with the AI4C certification. And so now IEEE is a new standard. I have a big plea for technical standards to fill all these gaps. The regulator is not in the position to do so. And about certification and testing. And so overall, all stakeholders need planning and legal certainty. And from my perspective as a mom, confidence in digital future means that we need joint forces. Responsibility is about transparency, modes of operation, and possible consequences of AI deployments. And so it brought me to the system what I established already in Deutsche Telekom world. Internally, and I try to so externally, and it helps. It is a so-called, and as you see it, in the middle, it's the AI ethics ecosystem, because these systems with the multiplayer, with the multi-interest has to come together and to combine this in an integrative modus about the risk and to mitigate the risk via guidelines, standards, certification, and ethics by design. So Christian, hopefully it helped a little bit from my introduction.
Oh, that helped a great bit, to be honest, because you dissected, I think, many areas we could discuss. I invite also the discussants to jump in if they would like, but unless you do, maybe Stefan, I might direct the first question to you, because you have worked quite a lot on the categorization of AI. And Manuela mentioned the difficulties of defining AI through legislation. So I wonder what your point on that would be in a regulation, how to define the very notion of AI.
You want me to address that question or the second question on the level? meaning the first question on how to categorize.
Yes.
Well, I think I agree with Manuela, and that's also, I think, the approach that we have taken across a variety of fields is that we need a lot more use cases in order to understand what are we actually talking about, because there are different applications, there are different purposes, because I do believe that in many of the AI environments, and as well as in the data environments, regulation, if any, should be guided by the purpose for which we use AI and data. And the purpose is dependent on the use case and the context in which AI is being applied. And I think what I feel quite often missing in the discussion about AI, anyway, and what it is actually a discussion about the purposes and what are the purposes we like to promote, and what are the purposes we would like to see limited, if not banned, with regard to the use of AI. And I think that's, from my point of view, quite often missing. Same discussion about risks, I think, is important, but it depends on the purpose. and having also a good understanding of what are the costs and benefits to actually guide how we use AI, including benefits as in societal benefits, I think is going to be crucial to become more sophisticated and actually making that kind of calculation before we, for instance, go into regulation that might be subjective depending on the use case and might, as a result, be problematic and fragmentary.
Yes, thank you very much for this contextualized approach, which I think is really important. So we have the problem that we need to look at the purposes, and on the other hand, as Manuela said, AI is a general purpose technology, so it can be used in very different ways. So maybe to pass the hot potato on to Maria, do you think that we can have a general legislation for AI, and do you think this could work, building upon what we just heard about the complexity of the general purpose nature of AI?
Well, I would say that that's a very interesting question, but I think we need to also take stock of what has happened so far, and the fact that we have seen an increased level of awareness of what AI technologies are, how we develop AI narratives that allow us to elicit and understand the life of autonomous agents around society, and what do we do with it. I think it's not enough just to have frameworks, experts. You also need to have incentives. As Stefan said and Manuela said, it's important to place those applications in the context of our society, the problems we are solving, and align it with a set of incentives, right? Because AI technology we develop should never be developed by the sake of it. And even certain type of technology, transparent or biased and ethical, should not be developed for the sake of this technology, but aligned with human goals. Only in that way, we are able to see a much more sustainable governance of AI, which we are discussing now. And in a way, if you look at the whole of the governance continuum, has different elements, but it has to be seen as a continuum. We start with ethical principles, which in fact is a governance mechanism, impact assessments, and you go into audit, and you go into standards, certifications, regulations, laws, and only when you see that in how they link with each other and how it's applied in a specific context, we'll get somewhere where we want to be. At the moment, I mean, to my frustration, I think a lot of those conversations happens in not only isolation, but they're not connected. Even in the world of AI ethics, the operationalizing of those principles are seen as something as a one-off or a piecemeal. And then we wonder why we don't see results. Is because there is a system. You know, we have to see this as a systemic approach, and realize that disruption not only AI technology brings, but also responsible AI technology. And that to manage that disruption, we have to be prepared. We have to invest in changing our internal capabilities, you know, building new capabilities inside our organization, right? Compliance and risk. How many organizations around the world outside financial services actually have a compliance function. Guess what? With AI, you kind of have to, because AI risk is not only managed by data scientists. You have to have a new set of experts that will look into those issues.
Yes, thank you very much. And let's just do that. We have 4 experts here who look into those issues. Maybe I'll pass one aspect of your statement, Maria, on to Norberto, because you mentioned that there needs to be incentives and in a way a structure to accommodate different actors, among them government and the industry. So Norberto, what does the industry from your perspective in a way expect from AI regulation, and what could these incentives be from an industry and maybe even government perspective?
Thank you, Christian. I'll share my screen. I have a slide.
Yes, the slide would come with the 4th question, as I told Stefan. So we have 4 questions.
Okay.
Your slide would come as an introduction to the 4th. So
okay. So sorry about that.
Excuse me,
okay.
I wasn't entirely clear. This was just a question still in the context of Manuela's input.
Great. So I mean, I think in terms of what the industry expects, but also has a role to meaningfully participate and shape the debate. So I think right now, as we've seen from the previous presentations, AI is really emerging as an area of lawmaking activity. We've long passed the area of ethical principles, and we are clearly moving towards legislative requirements. And as Maria mentioned, and I think this is a very important point, we should look at regulation more in terms of governance and look at how she framed it as this governance spectrum, and looking at different instruments, but also approaches through which you can govern and regulate the technology. And that calls into action different stakeholders within which you will find the industry as one of them. So when we look at the regulation of AI, we should really take a step back and look holistically at the different set of instruments, approaches towards the governance of AI. Law is one of them, but we know that there is the need to complement law with other instruments. So both self-regulation and co-regulation will play an important role. Standard setting organizations will play and are already playing an important role. I think another thing that is interesting is also to understand, within just looking at law in itself, the different approaches that you can have within the same piece of legislation. So if you look at the IEAI Act proposal, we can see approaches towards a precautionary approach to certain uses of AI that should strictly be banned, should not be developed in the first place. We see as a common thread a risk-based approach to AI regulation, that not all and every single use and application of AI should fall under regulatory scrutiny, but we should have a process in place to identify the risks that we as a society should be mitigating against. There's also an adaptive and experimental approach in the AI Act when we look at the section on sandboxes, where there is the need that the European Commission saw to create incentives, namely for startups to actually participate in this type of experimental programs to help refine the AI Act and understand how can certain companies developing cutting edge technologies can do that in a way that will be in compliance with the AI Act. So I think we are at a very interesting moment right now in regulation of AI, where we need to think very thoughtfully about the different approaches and how do they actually talk to one another. It's not a binary discussion of you either have law or not law. It's either how do you actually have an interactive ecosystem of governance instruments where law needs to play perhaps the most important role, but how can it actually be accompanied and interacted with other governance instruments. So I think one of the expectations of the industry will be to what extent industry leverage its technical expertise as developers of technology in this debate? To what extent can we inform the debate by participating more actively in the development of certain instruments that will complement and enrich the legislative path that we are going towards?
Thank you very much. I think for this first round of statements, I see a lot of convergence in the general complexity. Manuela mapped the context specificity that Stefan introduced. And then Maria and Norberto, you enlightened us as to the range of governance mechanisms and possibilities with or without the law to govern these situations, which I think is a very, very good ground to make progress now in our look on policy and regulation, and not only horizontally see the different ways and the different elements of our toolbox in regulating AI, but also vertically to see that we have very different areas. And Manuela, you mentioned that already, that there is different levels from which you could look at AI. And I think this is also given that regulation and policy is happening on different levels. This is a very good point to jump off with the second set of questions and concerning the levels. And here, Stefan, I would like to invite you to give us a short introduction and presentation of one aspect of this multi-level ways to govern AI.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. And indeed, I will only touch on one aspect, because I think what Manuela rightly introduced is that this is a complex area with multiple layers. And one of the things that I would like to build upon when reflecting on the different levels is actually also what Norberto was referring to, is that we do actually need experimentation and an understanding of different approaches in order for us to be able to compare what works within what context. And we cannot just have an abstract discussion about, anyway, regulation or governance, but actually we do need a lot more experimentation and then feedback loops on what works and how do we go about it in a manner that is responsible and aligned with, of course, values that we all subscribe to as well. And from my point of view, that experimentation is happening, but it's a lot happening under the radar. And what you already, Christian, was referring to, like the OECD and others that are monitoring policies, most of those policies, if not all, are at the national level. And the argument that I would like to make in my short presentation here is that actually experimentation as it relates to AI governance is happening at the local level. And that we really, in order to understand what works and what does not work, and what works within what context, we actually have to become more sophisticated around what works and what happens at the local level, which is something, as you know, that I have called AI localism, the phenomenon where actually cities are taking the lead quite often in experimenting with AI governance that we all should learn from and actually be more sensitive to, because a lot of the national policies could be informed, frankly, by what's happening at the local level. Now, obviously, talking about multiple levels, clearly cities don't act within a vacuum and also will be informed what happens at the supra and national level. But I think we also need to become more informed about cities as hub of innovations in governance, not only in technology, as it relates to the local level. And so what we have tried to do, more from a descriptive than purely a judgmental kind of approach, is we've tried to actually document what's happening at the local level. And so we have our AI localism repository of examples that we have cataloged on what is actually happening in different cities as it relates to AI regulation and AI governance. And so you can go to our repository. But from our point of view, there are X amount of instruments that are being experimented with. And so again, Norberto was referring to the toolbox, and indeed we see that cities are actually defining their toolbox, which we call the canvas of actually AI governance that is being experimented with. And it includes principles, it includes provisions with regard to transparency, it includes new accountability structures, and so on. And so what I will do is briefly, anyway, refer to what is happening very briefly with some examples. and then perhaps open up with actually a reflection on, anyway, what are the pros and cons of AI localism? Because again, I'm not advocating that cities always should take the lead, but I think what I'm trying to indicate in my brief presentation is that we should take notice. And at the moment, we don't quite often take notice. We only take notice what happens at the national and supranational level, but we could actually be informed what is happening at the subnational level as it relates to some of the AI governance areas. And so the first one is, of course, principles. And we've seen many cities are actually developing new kinds of principles around AI, such as the Barcelona Declaration and also Montreal. London has also come out with a London Charter where they try to come up with some principles. And of course, the key consideration here is, do we need more principles? Or do we actually need a consortium of cities that subscribe to a common set of principles? And also, what about other principles such as human rights? And why do we actually need always new principles? Should we not actually just have a basic standard of rights that we implement as well? And that's a discussion that is ongoing. The other area where cities have done a lot of work on under the rubric of AI governance is actually AI literacy. And so we've seen many cities actually investing in AI literacy in order to mitigate some of the risks, but also to inform the debate about AI, because a lot of the debate is quite often binary. Are you for or against? And of course, in any complex debate, it depends. And how do we provide citizens the tools to actually have that kind of sophisticated discussion? And so we see a lot of cities actually investing in AI literacies with local universities, but also with libraries as well. We also have seen a lot of experimentation in providing transparency, like in Helsinki and Amsterdam, where they actually have provided an open AI register where they document what services within the cities are actually using AI, so that there is transparency about the algorithms. But we also have seen other areas where increased transparency is happening. And of course, one of the considerations is, anyway, how do we go beyond just a repository of use of AI, but also actually having better risk assessment and even in some cases a nutritional label for AI products, so that we understand what is being used and what are some of the risks involved. The big area where cities have also done some work is actually on procurement. And I think if we think about toolboxes of governance, I think procurement needs to be a part of it, because government can quite often be a market shaper as it relates to technology. And I think we need to start using procurement as also a way to embed some principles on how we design technologies. And so procurement can be a way to actually make responsibility by design a reality if we embed some of those principles that require some design considerations. The question is, of course, how will that be transparent as well? And how do we make sure that, anyway, we have a procurement process that is actually transparent in its own right? The other area where we've seen a lot of experimentation is actually on engagement. As I said, AI literacy is quite often required. And so one of the initiatives that we here at GovLab have done is, for instance, around the creation of the Data Assembly, which is a citizens' assembly here in New York, around the use of data and AI. And we see actually a lot of cities are now really having that kind of public engagement strategy where, exactly as I mentioned, where they try to figure out what are the kind of purposes that people feel confident about or should be prioritized, and how do we go about then providing the conditions. We also see many cities are actually engaging with their local universities. And I think there's a great opportunity actually for universities to work with cities, right, such as TUM, for instance, in actually defining and experimenting with policies for the city as well. And of course, the key question is, of course, how do we deal with power asymmetries within cities when we deal with engagement as well? And we need to, of course, consider that as well. On the level of accountability, we've seen actually the creation of new task forces across cities, but also new functions, such as a designated algorithms management and policy officer in New York City, who actually has, and I think Maria was already referring to the need for new professions, but we also need new oversight professions within cities, for instance, that can actually enforce and oversee what is happening as well. And again, some examples on all the working groups that we see setting up within cities with regard to the use of AI as well. And again, the question here is, of course, anyway, it's great to have those working groups. Do they actually, are they actually being taken serious? And of course, we've seen that in New York, where there was a task force around automated decision-making, but ultimately there was no accountability with regard to public policymakers to actually listen to the task force and then subsequently also feed information as well. We also have seen a lot of experimentation and regulation, and you mentioned already, Christian, that facial recognition, of course, is being regulated at cities worldwide, which basically means quite often regulated as being banned. And I think we need a lot more sophistication there also around, anyway, thinking about what needs to be banned and what needs to be provided under specific conditions. But we see also here, for instance, again in New York, several regulations popping up at city councils. Last month, there was a regulation, actually a legislation being introduced around the use of automated decisions for employment, where there is actually a requirement now that there is a transparency with regard to the use of AI as it relates to employment as well. And so we need to take that into account. Again, this is just a quick whirlwind on the fact that things are happening in cities. Again, it's more descriptive because we could, of course, make a diagnostic on, is any of that actually adding up? But I think we need to take stock on AI localism. And the pros of AI governance at the local level is that it quite often fills a void because, anyway, despite the fact that we have numerous principles worldwide, we actually still have a void with actually how do you deal with AI in concrete use cases. And so cities are stepping in to actually fill that void. There's also a certain level of immediacy and a rapid feedback loop in cities that you don't have at the national level, where you actually can introduce and then rapidly see what happens. And of course, there is a stronger connection with communities than quite often at the national level. So you have that kind of social license if you do things at the city level that you quite often don't have at the national or supranational level. Now, there are, of course, cons as well, including the fact that it might actually create even more complexity and fragmentation, right? If every city is going to have its own kind of regulatory approach, then you will have massive fragmentation, which is why I think it's going to be interesting to see how cities are teaming up worldwide to actually have common kind of experimentation. And that's something that we're seeing as well, where we actually have consortium of cities now working together around some of those areas. We see also, of course, anyway, there was already mentioning the lack of capacity quite often, and that we need additional sources, including private sector sources, to actually inform what is feasible from a technological point of view. But that in itself might also create capture. And I think we need to also be sensitive that capture could also happen at the local level, where actually certain kinds of players might, of course, capture the regulatory information process. And that's something to be sensitive about. And again, we should not be nirvana. I think that cities are nirvana when it comes to political deliberation, right? We can also see that quite often that might actually be problematic as well. Anyway, this is the article of last year that we introduced the concept of AI localism. If anyone is interested to learn more, and more importantly, if anyone has pointers to examples that we can add to our repository, we would be delighted to include them, because obviously this is meant to be a crowdsourced initiative. So with that, Christian, I'm gonna stop sharing here, but I think the key message is that we need experimentation across all levels. There is actually a lot of experimentation happening at the local level. We should take stock and take notice and complement our quite often dominant focus on the national and supranational level by also actually thinking about what is happening at the subnational level. And within an European context, the whole issue of subsidiarity should also be taken into account when we look at those initiatives as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Stefan, for enlightening us with this local level of governance, which I think you gave the attention it deserves. I think it's a bias in academic focus, maybe also in policy focus, to not to perceive what is happening there, and it's really amazing to see that, and also that you describe first, but then try to build up or think what happens if we build up these principles Is there a fragmentation? Is there convergence? So what do we learn from that? Which I think is also a very, very insightful approach. So maybe I would, if I see no question as of now, my question would be a contrast. And to ask Manuela and Maria, because if I understood that correctly, you went actually the other way. Your companies, but also beyond that, you in a way developed early on general standards, so general principles, and then applied these principles in specific cases, or in a way applied them in specific local settings, which I assume at least might also, for example, for Deutsche Telekom, even though it's called Deutsche Telekom, will apply in different countries, different jurisdictions. So I wonder whether you can react to Stefan's input and tell us whether you have learned something in the application of the general frameworks you developed to specific cases.
So I don't know, Maria, would you like to start or should I start?
Go ahead, please.
So yes, we were one of the first companies to try to find the modus of operationalization, and this was really a difficult task, and that was the reason why I was introduced to Norberto, because we have these guidelines, and I always convinced in a compliance way you can do everything just together with others. And you are not alone there. You need inspiration. And this was the task internally that we designed a multidisciplinary team. And it was in South Korea, Israel was involved, America was involved, East Europe, West Europe, etc. And all disciplines Maria just mentioned. So that was the reason why I tried to design and to do more as empowerment for my guys in my team. So my team, there are specialists for data science, etc., but there are as well psychological people, so that we bring all these together. And while we try to operationalize our guidelines step by step, we found out what we were missing. And the first thing was, and maybe you know the Magenta speaker, the developer and data scientists asked us if they comply to law, if the voice is a neutral one, or must it be a female or a male one? And this is not a simple question, but you see, on one hand side, it was a cultural thing by profession, and it was a cultural thing. It depends if you're coming from the Asia continent or maybe from America and Israel. And so project by project, we involved all these specific interested people. And then when I was part of the AI level group with the European Commission as a reserve partner, I was so frustrated, and this is just a description from Maria, Norberto, yourself, Christian, and Stefan, that they are just focusing on theory and that not trying to integrate people, that they have a multi-team. That is why I'm always talking about the AI ecosystem. Bring people for specific project use cases together, find out what is important, then to find out and to calibrate which kind of risks are given. Because I understood when I had my discussion with the DNORM engineers, they have a totally different mindset what they are looking with regard to technical standards. And so, as Norberto just described, myself was the impact to discuss with all these stakeholders, and even as well with the society. We built up a so-called data ethics center in Berlin, where we had some examples for the technology. What does it mean, and where we maybe was a forepit, and where is the potential permanent good use for the society, AI for good for the society, as Maria mentioned, so that we could have the opportunity to involve everybody to our guidelines and what is important for them if they understand Deutsche Telekom better. And so it was really a long journey, and the journey is not stopped. And you have, so it is such a big mosaic of div level of integration of people understanding and all the tools, that it is a breathing mechanism, and you just can do it project by project. It must be really concrete. And so maybe I would like to hand over to Maria and her experience.
Thank you, Manuela. This sounds fantastic. What I wanted to say to compliment Stefan on his project there, Localism, and say hi to Mona Sloan. She's a friend. I think it's a fantastic concept, and I think it's exactly what's needed to kind of contract one of the shortcomings of those supranational organizations like the Global Partnership on AI. I think what we have seen in the last few years is like this nascency of lots of different organizations, global or national, but they don't deliver much, and a bit of a mistrust from the industry, from us, saying, oh, yet another organization, but how is this relevant and what's the role they play in the ecosystem? And the fact there is now at least a concept, and we've seen those best practices coming from cities that are much more in the trenches developing AI. It's a glimpse of hope that we actually can pilot and leverage those practices much faster. But I will say that in order for us to have success, it's also nice, will be great if we can actually align it with national strategies, initiatives. The reason I'm saying that, at least in the UK, there was a lot of conversations. We just released the UK AI national strategy, the first official one. Before that, we had a sector deal that was a bit more tactical than a strategy. And one of the big conversations within the strategies is how do we use AI to start growing in the regions, develop regions? In other words, how do we align AI technologies in growing economies of the regions? And when you put together the best practices in cities with the desire to finance innovation in different regions than the big tech hubs we have around the planet, you see not only a different approach to AI contributing to our society, but also being done in a responsible way, because all those cities that will benefit from this investment in AI ecosystems and infrastructure will also have a set of best practices that you guys leverage, and being able to do it all, two in one, meaning that they will not be required to experiment themselves because someone else has done it, and they have done it, that they can pick it from there. But coming back to our experience in PwC and how we came about it, I think we are in a bit of a different position than you, Manuela, and Norberto. The fact that we are a professional services company, right? We work with 85% of FTSE 100 companies. Therefore, we are exposed of all the challenges across sectors and use cases. As a result, one of the first things we started to iterate at the beginning of our AI Center of Excellence in 2017 was, but how do we do it responsibly? And what's the role of a company like PwC can play into educating, first of all, of the need to account for the impact beyond the technical layer, and the fact that AI will is bringing a disruption we are not prepared to manage. Therefore, how do we do it? And of course, first we looked into identifying all the rules that could be applied to develop responsible AI. And then we research hundreds of documents, we distill 155 different principles, but then we aggregate them. We realize that there's a lot of overlap, and in fact, there are nine or 10 meta ethical principles that everyone can apply, whatever their context. But the next thing that we've elicited in our work is to say that the context is king, right? Because those ethical principles and the value systems are very much entrenched to the cultures that they are emerging from. A lot of the principles, on one hand, are being developed by Western culture, but the Western culture tend to be quite individualistic focused, and therefore the principles that were created in the Western countries are not applicable in more collective culture like East Asia and Middle East. So how do we make sure that if we have a set of rules, they are not the last word, they are not the capital truth, because that has to be validated in the context of the culture. And the culture has multiple layers. We have the national culture, we have the regional culture, but then obviously the business ones, and even inside the corporation, if you look at, you'd find an array of different cultures as a result of a company being global and being impacted by, on one hand, the shareholders and the values and the culture where they come. And we went in iteration of picking up those principles and see how they're relevant in financial services. And in financial services, then, what are the most or the key ethical dilemmas and principles we need to be considered in industry, but then going case study by case studies. And the last layer of our work was to say, how do we make this sustainable? How do we make sure that this is going beyond the nice to have and something we do once in a while, but become part of a business as usual? And that's the hardest one. And that's exactly what we are doing at the moment, because I'm focusing on doing this to ourselves. And we see that on one hand, once there is a higher awareness that those issues that are fundamental for the way we work with AI, there are also conflicting priorities. You know, in the light of post-pandemic recovery, you see a lot of organizations prioritizing survival post this period. Therefore, how would you prioritize responsible AI when you are actually fighting to survive, or you are investing massively to digitize your operation? The reality is, well, we know from our clients, the vast majority of businesses, the ones that matter, are still struggling with digitization. A lot of their systems are on premise, or they have hybrid clouds, and they have a mess in their enterprise architectures. For them, AI is still a bit of like a fairy tale because they're not ready to do it. So in this context, how do we fight for for what we think is right, responsible AI, and how do we make sure that we transform once we see those transformation programs? How do we align the philosophy of responsible AI to those transformation, and again, do 2 in 1, you know, piggybacking on those issues. It's an evolving story, and I would say that what I would like to see more is the technical community being a bit more involved in those conversations. I think because we have not educated our engineers and computer scientists in school that those issues are fundamental. We have a bit of a gap, a generational gap, I would say, in between the students of today and the practitioners of today, in a sense that we need to start changing perceptions and mindset of those in the field right now, that we shouldn't use the philosophy of Silicon Valley of, can I do it, right? We actually now have to pause and think, should I do it if there are consequences, and how well do I manage the consequences?
Thank you very much. Very rich, high-level observations, starting out with this theme, how you actually went from principle to practice. And indeed, this then opens up a lot of questions. But before I come to the questions from the audience, I would like to invite again Norberto now to comment on the convergence, because we've seen this bottom-up approach. Then we discussed top-down issues of, in a way, framing a policy, a framework, and then applying it in practice. So how do you think can we manage convergence between different levels, and or can we manage convergence between different levels, and how would you approach that? You're still muted, Norberto.
Sorry, amateur mistake here. Yes, so going right to that question, I think there are various ways to understand, identify the various levels, and then calibrate them. And I think the key to the AI governance debate is really calibration of different modes and instruments of regulation. And as it was mentioned, there is a lot of silos and discussions happening in isolation, and there is not a lot of interconnection between different fields of study, but also different philosophies of regulation, and how do they manifest themselves in different instruments. So one way that, through that Facebook Meta now is approaching this is really to understand and present the value of experimentation. And we all know why this is important. AI poses obviously regulatory challenges in terms of understanding what is the best regulatory pathway, the best governance sequence of instruments and calibrations between them to govern this technology in a responsible way. But there are also technical challenges. The technology in itself presents challenges like intrinsic complexity, its own opacity of certain systems, the way that is constantly evolving, its dynamic nature that makes it difficult to actually measure its impact. So this compounds to a number of uncertainty factors that really call into action the value of experimentation. And I think there is not enough experimentation happening, although there are some welcoming signs through namely the so-called regulatory sandboxes in the field of AI governance. So one way to do this, and I'll briefly present, I'm not sure if I can actually present my slide. I'm getting a notice here for some reason.
Yes, I don't know what the reason is. We, in a way, planned this for the fourth question, Norberto, if you allow that your presentation, because this will be then the topic of sandboxing. Unless you want to do it now.
No, we could. No, we can. Sorry, yeah.
Have it as
I did not. Sorry, I should have followed up with you more closely for the run-up show. No, totally fine. So two things very quickly here before we talk then at the later point in time about the experimentation. Just commenting on Stefan's presentation, which is fascinating. And I've learned a lot through that brief presentation. I would love to delve deeper into some of those insights. But there is two quick things that I think are interesting and that actually connect to some of the work that we've been doing. I think this idea of immediacy, of actually understanding what is the right setting where the technology actually exerts an impact, and look at that to understand what are the best practices that are emerging to govern that technology. I think that is phenomenal. And one of the things, because one of the main questions of AI is really to understand, how can we make it a participatory mechanism of governance? How can we actually involve populations that might be impacted by these technologies into the governance of this very same technology? And obviously, it makes a lot of sense to look at the cities. So I haven't seen this a lot, and I now seen this presentation, and it makes so much sense that I'm asking myself, why didn't we look at this before? One thing that is closely related is one idea that we have in terms of our experimentation is to kind of kill the middleman of the lawyers and the public policy professionals, and actually to test the law to its direct addressees, which are, in terms of AI, the AI developers. And one of the things that we've been looking at is how actually a legal text with its formalities, with its legalese, which is with its own processes and vocabulary, how does it actually resonate with the product managers, with the engineers, with the designers that are actually building and deploying the technology? So there is also a sense for us to search this immediacy, to understand what is the immediate, the direct addressee of this regulation, how does it actually resonate with them? Figuring out the right way to translate those legal instruments into something that is a practical guidance. And we've done this through what we call playbooks that complement normative propositions. The other comment that I wanted to leave is understanding also the AI ethics debate, understanding the different cultures and how they actually implement principles. And one of the things that we're actually looking at in terms of, again, an experimental governance program is to look at certain principles that are actually drafted in a very similar way. So we look at, for example, the principle of human centricity, and you have a manifestation of that both in Japan and in India. And what we're looking at is actually how do you implement and operationalize a principle that is actually drafted in a similar way, but in a very different context, in a very different regional setting. How can you actually put together a playbook that will allow those principles to be implemented while respecting and observing regional and local factors? Because I think that's the crux of the matter, is to understand that implementation when you look at the regional factors. because if we look at the principles in themselves, there is a large consensus on the main values, and they are actually kind of drafted in a similar way. So we need really to delve deeper into the implementation to understand what are the differences, because they will emerge, and how can we actually help folks on the ground to actually implement and operationalize those principles in different regions. So let me stop here, but those were two comments that come to mind with the presentation that I've just listened.
Great, thank you very much for that, and sorry for me sticking to the original plan, but you will be on in a minute, and I think we should take your question seriously and now come to the implementation and the question what we actually do, which I divided in two questions. So the one about mitigating risks, and the other about, in a way, harnessing the potential. Stefan, there is a question for you in the chat. If you will, you could maybe address it in a written form, not to lose this question. And then I would give the floor to Maria for your input concerning the mitigation of risks.
Thank you, Christian. We already discussed a lot about risks, so I'm just going to add a few extra points on top of what we discussed. There was an interesting phenomenon that has happened in the last few years since our media was flooded with examples of misuse, abuse, or irresponsible use of AI. We've seen a lot of headlines from an a tool developed by Amazon that was biased against women, a card was again biased against women, a policing tool that discriminates against people of color. And that comes in a context where discuss very little about the dark side of AI. When the whole AI madness started, and when I say madness, I say prominent in the public domain, it was probably at the beginning of 2017, when post Davos, a lot of the leaders present there will come back after Schwab's discuss for the first time what happens with the jobs that are going to be automated, how robots are going to take our jobs, only for in the following months to hear from some celebrities and scientists say, oh, but the robots are going to take over the world, and generate a bit of interest of existential risks. But we haven't talked a lot about the real and present dangers because we didn't see such cases. And suddenly we actually started to see those cases, so much so that we started discussing about how autonomous car has unfortunately killed a passenger, and that case made headlines around the world of how it's treated by the judicial system and who was ultimately held accountable. And all this discussion about the dark side of AI is a real and present dangers has raised the level of awareness on both camps. First, the society and the consumer who have gradually started to demand better products and services powered by AI, or when AI is the product or the service. So much so that the economist studies performed in 2019, the business case of responsible AI, in fact, has identified that 66% of the consumer interviewed say they demand fairer algorithms. About 67% they will demand accountability in case something goes wrong. On the other side, on the business owners side, we've of course conducted some studies to understand what our clients think in terms of AI adoption, experimentations, governance, and risks. And while we went from several years back where AI risk was a side topic in the conversation around AI, was very much focused on how do we scale. You know, probably scaling AI was one of the biggest topics we had in the years to come. Now, gradually in the last 2 years, we've seen an acceleration of the topic of AI risk and now becoming a strategic imperative, so much so that 85% of the CEOs we've asked 3 years ago, they say the AI risk is a strategic initiative, only for us to see this demonstration or declaration of the CEOs manifest in practice, with 4 in 10 companies now having strategies and plans to manage AI risk. And also, very interesting is that 45% of those who are in early stages experimenting with AI are doing it in a responsible and ethical manner, considering the risk, which again, I put it very much on the fact that we have these conversations like the ones we have today, and we educated everyone in society that we need to be balancing benefits and risk, as Stefan said. Looking at how do we mitigate risk, I propose 3 recommendations. They're very much linked to our experience working with clients, especially in financial services, where the awareness of AI risk is higher because of the nature of the industries and the fact that they are much more mature in risk management in general, and they will have the right organizational structure in place to manage risk. First recommendation is to look at operationalizing ethics as the most efficient way of mitigating risk. And I'm saying this because if you look at the taxonomy of the AI risk, the vast majority of those risks are in fact ethical risk: bias, opacity, instability, adversarial attack, lack of accountability, misuse, abuse. All those are linked with ethical principles. So if we in organizations will have an honest and sustainable effort to translate the values and ethical principles into design and governance requirements, is the best way for us to mitigate those risks. And linked with this, it's probably a call for researchers to explore a little bit more in detail the relationship between risks and ethics. You know, I've posed this question to some of my friends in the academia at Oxford and Cambridge, and I said to philosophers, what about ethics and risk? What is ethics to risk and risk to ethics? And they said, oh, well, that's a great idea for us to explore, because if we actually bridge those 2 elements, we'll realize is probably business ethics has done for a while, to say that risk management is one of the intervention in the wider ecosystem of ethics management. And business ethics has done this in the past, you know, it's just a matter of us of learning from them, but also understanding the context of AI, the relationship between ethics and risk. The second recommendation, it has to do with building organizational capacity. As we've seen, and I discussed earlier, European Commission Act will put pressure for organizations to carry on conformity assessment, which is a regulatory requirement. In order to do that, you have to have the right people with the right skills and the right processes. It's not a one-off. More likely, it's going to be a continuous process. There was only 2 studies so far identified that were talking about the increased cost of compliance as a result of EU Act, and with 2 bulk figures that speak. One of it is 4 to 5% of the cost of the application. The other one is 70%. But regardless of the figures, I think the reality that organizations need to think what happens after I deploy my tool or I deploy the tools I've acquired as a third party, and how do I learn to live and operate with AI, and how do we make sure that we assess the performance of the AI application and make sure that we correct it as required. And the third recommendation is to start honestly building for auditable system. We have heard that a lot of the initiatives in the field of applying ethics, governance, and even risk management have not yet delivered. We still have biased application, and even if we apply the right technical measures, as was the case with the famous Amazon AI recruitment tab, in the end, it still turned out to be discriminatory against women, because there's much more to something like fairness than just a technical patch that you apply to the data. So what is really important is that we need to have ways to be able to demonstrate some progress to all the stakeholders, because we are on a path of building trustworthy in AI systems. And as we don't go on questions how a plane operates, and we don't open the hood to see how the engine of our BMW operates, we do have trust in the automotive industry, so is in the travel industry. Therefore, if we want to get there with the technology company, we need to be able to demonstrate to the external audiences what we do, it achieves some sort of a progress. And the way to do it is to make sure that we have means to audit those systems. And why the audit of AI, it's now a sideline topic. We had a workshop previously to our sessions about this topic, and I've seen several initiatives run in the States. Few, as Stefan mentioned, at the city level, is still not the main topic. And the reality is that AI assurance and audit, regardless what term you use, seems to be the perfect element to allow us, on one, to test that the measure we have implemented have got us to the result we desire, get a bit of certainty that once machine learning models continue to drift while they are deployed, they are consistent in their performance. And thirdly, in doing so, we publish the results so that the stakeholders understand not only what we have done, but see the progress. And I would be keen to promote the AI audit as one of the most important governance tools. All are important in their own little way, as that governance continues, just discussed earlier, and the role of the laws and the standards and the process. But AI audit seems to be closing the loop and allows us to test how everything that we have done is for the best. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting and spot on remark, Maria. You really outlined 3 points, and I would like to hand this over together with a question from the audience to the other panelists. So the question is, I was wondering if any of the panelists could expand on whether they would rather rely on, and here are your two options, soft law or hard law to regulate AI on a national and EU level. Thank you. So if you want to comment on this question, and the second thing I would add is for you to react on Maria's 3 points. Operationalization of ethics with a special view on the intersection of ethics and risks, building organizational capacities, and start building auditable systems. So would you add to this list? Can you emphasize one of the points? It would be great to make the round of all of our panelists, and may I invite Norberto to start?
There's a lot in there. Let me start with the question from the audience. I would reiterate what I said at the beginning. I don't think this is a binary decision. You either go for one or the other. I think the trick here is to understand the right complementarities between hard law and soft law. And one of the things that I think is important is to understand, both the benefits and the trade-offs of the different governance mechanisms. I mean, legal regulation obviously has a lot of advantages in terms of, providing certainty to AI agents developing, implementing this technologies, to ensuring accountability, to being backed up by an enforcement mechanisms to make sure that these things are being followed. Then at the same time, they're not like a silver bullet for that works well in every single respect. I mean, laws can be slow to respond and adapt to new technologies. It can have some difficulties in keeping up with the latest technical advancements. So you need to inject some flexibility into legislation to make sure that it keeps being meaningful and purposeful for the values that is protecting. If we look at soft law, like self-regulation, obviously having and leveraging the input from technical stakeholders is important, especially in such a complex technical area like AI and understanding the complexities of machine learning models. It is very important to have the folks that are actually developing these systems chiming in and providing their technical input into how these types of legislation that are to some extent prescriptive at the technical level. You know, when we talk about transparency and explainability requirements or fairness measurements, these involve difficult and complex technical issues. So obviously with soft law and the prominent role of the actors that are actually developing the technology, this can help having a more informed governance mechanism, and can also help with innovations and flexibility. But at the same time, again, it's not a silver bullet solution. There is the perennial problem of, you know, lack of accountability, difficulty with implementation. How do we actually enforce it? So then we go to co-regulation, where you try to marry the best of both worlds, or you can have these actors actually working together and delineating some guidelines with strong technical input that can then be enforced or monitored by public sector agencies. So there is a lot of complexity, and just trying to understand, should we go for hard or soft law is not the best frame to look at this question. So I would encourage, you know, people from the policy community, from the business community, civil society, academia, really to understand better how these different governance instruments actually interact with one another, what are their strengths and their limitations, and what is the right calibration amongst them to provide the best results. In terms of risks and accountability, I will mention that in my remarks. Well, I will stop here and give the floor to another of my fellow panelists.
So Stefan, I do not know if you would like something to add. I can give some insight from my telecom experience with regard to the 3 points from Maria. So as compliance lady, I always want to be ahead of the regulator because I'm an entrepreneur. And that means I have to work with hybrid thinking and bring people together. And with our initiative, it was a result that our data scientist, our programmer, our legal expert, and as Maria described, make it transparent that they have no knowledge about the other things like me. I trained myself about the technology while I was in America, in Israel, and in Asia. So, and that is the open-minded approach, and that made it possible that we designed already our compliance risk assessment where the ethical impact with regard to AI is implemented. And this is, as Christian mentioned it already before, we had our privacy and security assessment because I left Deutsche Telekom, but we have this privacy and security assessment procedure. And we did everything to us to make it possible to use existing bodies and existing procedures, because you have to have a breathing system. And we fight for it, that our criteria catalog with regard to ethics implemented. And it helps us because we have these specific use cases with the Magenta Speaker, with Magenta app, and with some chatbots, etc., etc. And so it helped us. It's this community pleased for that we could implement these criteria into this procedure where it was a click system. And then we got more transparency, and all of a sudden we found out which kind of holistic view we now had, which kinds of AI project has been in the air. And then our software designer and the engineer, they asked us, oh, could you educate us? And we would like to do a roadshow through the whole group. And as Maria mentioned, because the different mindset of the Asian people in Saudi Arabia and America, and with the values, a different one. Even if you want to have corporate values, you have these different kind of mindsets and so on. And so they educated themselves via roadshows, and we made it more tangible which kinds of risk could exist. And then the next step was that they asked they would like to have a profession ethics code, because what is about liability? They have been afraid as employer to be confronted if something will be a misuse or something with a technical system will run wrong. And so we helped them, and we understood that by ourselves better, where we have to make up more the blind spot. And this brought us to the next idea to say, okay, we have to design a technical impact assessment. And this is where we invited experts from the society, from academia, etc., pp, to join us with the dimension of society, company, environment, and what does it mean to the specific technology, and what is the specific impact. And that brought us to the next thought, Maria, What is about a trend radar with the technological impact in the air? So what should we just try to anticipate, and where should we educate our stakeholders? And then for sure, in my role, I would like to talk with the regulator and with my multi-interdisciplinary team externally out of Deutsche Telekom, sector, cross-sectoral. And this made it possible in the end that we had an audible system where we conducted this first certification thing, and with the Ben Gurion University in Israel, where we had this laboratory, we designed a testing tool, just step by step. And so this is a whole mosaic, Maria, as you described, with these three dimensions. It is really a quite good experience because it works. If different disciplines work together and listen to each other via use cases. Sorry, I hope it was not so emotional, but I was really convinced about this kind of a procedure.
Thank you very much for highlighting that, and also explaining another loop within Maria's 3 points. Stefan, if you could comment in 2 minutes max.
Yeah, 2 minutes, short minute. That's always hard for me, Christian, but I will try. No, first of all, I would say I totally agree with Maria on the points and with the ways to actually, anyway, step up our efforts to assess the risk for misuse or abuse. And I think the risks are real, the concerns are real, and we really, as a society, need to advance the way we go about it in a manner that indeed, as Maria showed or indicated, that shows progress, because it's we need to go beyond diagnosing. We actually also need to solving the risks and the problems that we have then diagnosed as well. But I would also argue that in addition to the risk of misuse, we really also need to broaden the conversation on what's the risk of misuses of data and AI to society. And I think too often, the discussion is about risk of misuse, which I think, as I said, is crucial to get right. But we also need to have a discussion about how do we prevent misuses, and more importantly, misuses as a result of asymmetries in society, such as data asymmetries, i.e. those that have access to data and those that need access to data, but don't have a way to actually leverage the data that could be used for generating new insights, for leveraging AI, such as, for instance, COVID-19, to actually do a systematic review of what actually makes a difference in, for instance, preventing infections as well. And I think we need to think about new institutional approaches. This is not just, and this could be a soft law kind of approach, it's not just about rules. It's really about what are the public-private partnerships that we need in order to actually leverage data that quite often is stovepiped, and quite often is siloed, and including the AI expertise in a way that then can generate insight for the public interest as well. And clearly, anyway, Meta has its Data for Good initiative. I was on a panel last week with Deutsche Telekom, where they also were referring to some of the initiatives that they had within the context of COVID-19. But we need to really ramp this up if we not only, right, are focusing on the misuse, but we also then actually start using data and AI for the societal problems that we have in a responsible way. And I think that's also a risk for not getting it right as well.
Thank you very much for this very strong and pointed statement, which I think now leads very well to another highlight, which I tried and managed to save for the finale of this session. And this is your input, Norberto, where we don't want to focus on risks, but also on how to harness the potential and the good things of AI, which we could look into a lot of governance measures. But also we focus now on the role of regulation, and you have an input prepared for that. So the floor is yours for the finale of our conversation.
Thank you, Christian. I hope you can see my slide. I know we're running out of time, so I'll be very, very brief. So, I mean, when we talk about AI, there's a lot of emphasis on technological innovation. I think when we talk about governance, there is still a lack of regulatory innovation and creativity in how to go about the governance of this technology. And the funny thing about it is that the solution might be, to some extent, in how the technology is developed and how we can actually emulate that process when we think about policy and lawmaking. So Open Loop was born with this mindset, and it's basically a global program, a global initiative that tries to bridge the gap between those that are developing the technology, and those that are regulating them. So there are a series of pilot projects, exercises of experimental governance, where we are deploying what we call a policy prototyping methodology. So I think one thing that is important also to bear in mind is how does this policy prototyping actually interacts with another, let's say, experimental governance methodology, which is the now becoming very famous regulatory sandboxes. And they kind of both belong to the same family, but they operate in a different ecosystem. So, and I'll be very brief. Regulatory sandboxes, operate, under regulatory authorities' purview, and it operates within existing legislation. So the main objective of regulatory sandboxes is to allow for technologies, for startups to continue innovating with their own technical advancements while being able to still comply with existing legislation and understanding how to do so. So the idea is to stretch and enable the existing legislation to still accommodate these new technical advancements. Policy prototyping is similar, but it actually takes a step back, chronologically speaking. So it actually operates in the absence of formal hard law, piece of legislation, and it tackles experimentation of the policy or legislative development that is in flight. So the idea is to test not the technology in itself, but through the technology test what is being discussed in terms of normative provision that can be, it can end up being in the law, can be part of a code of conduct, can be guidelines, can be ethical principles. So anything that is actually normative in nature can be a good candidate for the open loop. But the idea here is to think, when we talk about experimentation, more holistically. There is, and we welcome the emphasis on regulatory sandboxes, but there's also space for experimentation, chronologically speaking, before. Let's do experimentation before we actually pull the trigger in terms of legislation, and understand at that point in time what works and what doesn't, and how do those normative ideas and requirements actually resonate with the real world before we actually crystallize them in legislation. So Open Loop is a series of collaborative pilot projects. They really try to fill this gap between those that govern and those that develop the technology. You can look at them as a sort of regulatory innovation labs. And the idea is, as I just mentioned, to test this normative provisions through companies and their actual developers. So product managers and engineers that are actually building a machine learning model that is powering a given product or service. How does that normative provision actually resonates with their day-to-day work? So understanding really the technical feasibility of some of these provisions by really going into the heart of the technological development. They are empirical in nature. The whole purpose of the program is to provide evidence-based input by collecting feedback from AI developers regarding those normative provisions, and to inform policymaking and lawmaking by giving that evidence-based input to lawmakers as a added value to the discussions that we are having. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is kind of taking a page on how technology actually is built. We never have the first version going to market. There is a series of iterations, of experimentations, of testing before you actually are comfortable in putting a given product or service in the market. Let's try to do a bit more of that also in policymaking, where we can have more iteration, more experimentation before we actually pull the trigger. The process is pretty simple. I'll go very quickly. We start by gathering the right set of partners and participants in the program. We choose a specific topic. We do not test, for example, the AI Act, a comprehensive legislation. We focus on specific topics, and we have open loop programs specifically on risk assessment, on transparency and explainability, or on operationalization of specific ethical principles. And then we do the testing. So we either co-create a set of normative provisions if they're lacking in a given jurisdiction, or we test an existing one. And then we tested by asking the product managers and the engineers to actually follow that normative provision in the development of the AI machine learning model. And throughout this process, we observe and we collect their feedback of how do they actually go about following it, understanding what are both the strengths and the limitations of those normative provisions and how can we actually make them better. So we keep learning, iterating until we reach a certain set of empirical recommendations that then we package in a report that we publish under a Creative Commons license, and that we want others to build upon that and to actually be meaningful towards advancing the debate on governance and regulation of AI. So very quickly, I will skip. We have a concrete methodology on how we do this step by step in terms of policy prototyping. We've been doing this in the COVID era, so we've been doing this all virtually, and we've been using a mobile ethnography app. So in the same way that marketeers use certain apps to test how certain products and services are adopted and used by a sample of users, we actually use similar apps, but instead of testing the product or the service, we test the policy, we test the norm, the rule. And obviously with workshops and other online meetings and sessions that we do to gather all the input that we then package in our reports. It's a global initiative. We are live in different regions of the world. Depending on the jurisdiction, we will have very different programs. For example, in APAC, we are partnering with Singaporean IMDA, Infocomm's Media Development Authority, to test their AI governance model framework in what relates to transparency and expandability. So an existing governance framework. And we are doing this with 12 AI companies in the region. In Mexico, in Latin, we're actually testing also transparency and expandability, but actually there we co-created from scratch a playbook and a prototype law for this type of requirement. And in India, we are actually looking at the personalization of a number of ethical principles. I will just conclude by giving you some really bullet telegraphic notes on the program that we actually finalized. That this was on AI risk assessment in Europe. And here the idea was to test an AI risk assessment that would be conducted by the companies themselves. So we gathered a number of AI companies, mostly of them startups in Europe, and we tested this normative framework on how this could be done in Europe. The policy prototype was actually structured into two different sections. We had the prototype law. We actually draft something that looks like a law with recitals and articles that actually explain the requirement that needs to be followed. But then we complement that with what we call a prototype guidance. This is a sort of playbook. And this is one of the most novel parts of the project. And I'll have some screenshots here. So for example, we give the companies kind of a step-by-step explanatory, user-friendly document that explains, for example, what are the main values relevant to AI. We also give them a step-by-step methodology on how to go about not only identifying the risk, but also mitigating them by giving them a list of examples, step-by-step methodologies that will actually help them make sense of a normative requirement and apply it in practice. We conclude by having a report. There are a number of recommendations that I don't have time to go through it now, so I'll stop. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. This was really something to wait for, and luckily we have another 3 minutes, and I think we should have somebody react to your presentation. So given that there is a question to Manuela, I would kind of factor both things together and say, Manuela, you were asked about definitions of explainability and trustworthiness, whether this should be legally defined or not. Looking also at the testing, the testing of regulation that Norberto proposed and actually did. What would you think about the definition, and how do you see this kind of testing regulation in practice?
So on one hand side, it's always something you need ground floor with everybody together to discuss about something. And with regard to explainability and trustworthiness, we defined AI for us and in our guidelines what was meant to us, and it is a normal definition that AI and machines and computer systems, it imitates processes, characteristics that marks human intelligence, such as being able to learn, to think logistically, and to correct oneself. So this is always a button. I need something to grow up. And this is what we did as well with regard to explainability and with regard to trustworthiness, and in a combined team, in our multidisciplinary team. So, and on the other hand side, for sure, I absolutely agree with Roberto. I like it. It is what we try to design with our Ben Gurion University. And it is a combination, Roberto, what you did, what is our risk assessment and what is our technology impact assessment. And I like the dimension. So I would cut here to have the opportunity for the other panelists to participate and to bring their thoughts in.
Yes, given that we have 1 minute, maybe I'll give you a final pointy possibility to wrap it all up. So if you could recommend or highlight one measure, one focus of governance that our audience and policymakers should take into account. You had 2 sentences to pitch. What would you say? So a very pointed statement in the end. If we should take away one thing from your perspective from this discussion, what would this be? Yeah, I always tell my PhD students it's the most difficult thing to boil your message down to a few sentences, to explain your project in a few sentences. Of course, you are masters of the craft. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first. It's simple. What I said before, build auditable systems. If you start thinking about how my system could be audited, then you'll definitely put in place some robust governance mechanisms. So aim for auditability.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who's next? Maybe Stefan, you seem to be ready.
Sure, and I'm just going to build upon what Norberto said, which I think is a great effort. And I think the message is indeed is that we not only need to innovate in the technology space, but we also need to innovate in the policy space. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why we created GovLab, as you know, was to actually advance innovative ways of developing governance. But it does not mean that traditional principles of good governance, such as legitimacy, based upon participation, based upon representation, transparency, and accountability, should not be applied to the experimentation as well, right? And I think that's why I think it's really important to innovate, but to innovate in a legitimate manner, which includes innovate with people that will be affected by whatever comes out of the innovation of policies. And I think that's something, was my question to Norberto on how do you make sure that it's not just the technologists that are part of the prototyping, but you also actually have other mini publics, as we call them, make sure that they also are part of the sprint that you're developing.
Yeah, probably I'll go next. I think that's a really good question, and it's something that we've been focusing more within just the technology sector. We were very focused in making sure that whatever we're experimenting also works for startups and small, medium enterprises. We did not want this to be like a big tech company that will have obviously more easily at hand the resources to comply, generally speaking. So one of the things that was really enriching for me in the experience of deploying this program is really working hand in hand with startups, with companies that would not have, a public policy department, will have, one lawyer taking care of all of the legal aspects, and understand how, for example, these questions about should we define explainability, transparency. We found out this in LATAM. We absolutely need to define it, not like procedurally be prescriptive on how you actually reach it, but have really signal to the companies what do these values actually mean. So it is important to define them. I think that the next step in this journey of the open loop is, and as we've already started, is to work more and more with civil society, with academia, with samples of populations that are impacted by these technologies to make this really more inclusive and more holistic. My final note would be, let's look at the experimentation in a much more holistic manner and not only focus on a specific moment in time of the lawmaking process. There is experimentation before and after that can actually be made and deployed. And I think that I'm very excited for the years to come to really develop more methodologies and to look at this more holistically and just not focusing on just a legislation that is now in existence and try to make it better. Let's look at before and actually after as well.
And to embrace you all, so it's about a transparent, integrative, overall risk mitigation concept.
Excellent. This was to the point, as were the other statements. I shall thank the panelists very much for their insights and for the informations and views you provided. I think a lot of themes reverberated: governance, innovation, experimentation, looking closely at the operationalization of ethics and how to put things to work. I think a lot of food for thought and further reflection, hopefully just what the conveners of this conference aimed for. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the audience, and apologies that we ran a little late, entirely my fault, of course, but I think it was worth it, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference and join me in thanking the panelists virtually. Now only I can applaud, of course, but you should imagine a really strong applause. Thank you very much.